Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about Eragon by Christopher Paolini. So this is purely because we got Murtagh coming up, so I wanted to kind of give myself a refresher on the series because I've always considered the series to be really good. I've always liked it, even though the adaptation has basically ruined the reputation of the series in my opinion. I kind of want to talk about the good stuff, of course. So as always, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and let's begin. So, Eragon. Eragon, the story that is considered to be incredibly generic, nothing but tropes and cliches of the genre. I kind of agree with that while I completely disagree with the conclusion that a lot of people have come to. Mostly in the wake of the adaptation, a lot of people kind of dismiss Eragon as just a tropish kind of generic fantasy story that's just nothing but the hero's journey, point by point, which it kind of is, but there is a lot of stuff in it that just gets completely ignored just for the sake of that argument. So I want to first start off talking a little bit about the adaptation. So this is going to have full spoilers for both the adaptation and the book. Complete spoilers open in this discussion because it's an old enough story that I think it's okay to kind of go into it like that. So, the adaptation, I noticed, they essentially took out every single thing that was unique about the story. So, yes, the story does use the very classic hero's journey, as an outline, essentially. And of course, we have all the cliches of high fantasy that are essentially the tropes that were made famous by Tolkien. So we've essentially added all that into the story. So every pretty much every coming of age type of fantasy will use a lot of these tropes. The hero's journey is obviously one of the most popular tropes in existence for a reason. So these ideas and these cliches and stuff like that are not new, but the difference is most every writer who uses these tropes will try to do something to differentiate it, to make it their own, so that you can see it from their unique perspective. And Christopher Pauline definitely did that. Even at the young age he was when he started writing the series, he had a lot of really interesting and unique ideas that he interjected into the story. So I thought it was hilarious that the adaptation literally does nothing but strip all of that stuff out. Every single thing that they take out of the story in order to adapt it was either foreshadowing for later books or was the unique things that give the story its own identity, which I thought was like, wow, that is so Hollywood. Like, you take something that is actually really interesting and cool and just flatten it to the most generic, easily digestible version you possibly can. So that's essentially my opinion of it. Even though when I saw it, I had to have been probably 18 or something. I really loved the movie because apart from werewolves and mermaids or mer creatures, I love dragons. Dragons, it's probably a tie between like werewolves and dragons, my two favorite fantasy creatures. But dragons, actually, I don't know. Dragons might be. I don't know. I go back and forth. Werewolves and dragons. I love dragons. So this story was just exactly, basically made for me, especially at the time because I was still reading it, just nothing but YA. So it was exactly tailor made for me. So this story always has like held a special place in my heart because I saw the movie and then I really liked the movie, and my grandmother had the hard copies of Eldest and Brissinger at the time. This was before Inheritance was even, a part of the series. So I basically watched the first movie and then immediately read the next two books. And I think it's also credit to the adaptation that they left enough of the core of the story in that adaptation that I didn't feel confused at all when I just jumped into the second and third book. So that's, my opinions essentially on the adaptation. There will definitely be a reaction to the adaptation that will be linked down on Patreon. And it will probably, maybe I'll do a review of it here just to kind of generally talk about it, even though I kind of already have. But yeah, with that being said, let's actually talk about the book. So, Eragon, as I've already said, it is very much the classic hero's journey. It is really interesting in that the main cliches of the main character of a hero's journey is like, of course, they will be perfect. Like, more or less, they'll be perfect. But a lot of the cliche stuff, well, not even cliche, a lot of the things that a lot of people would generally kind of immediately get bored with by like, when I say that, I mean things like the classic fantasy trope things that your main protagonist gets into. Eragon is basically a prodigy. He is an immediately good swordsman. Like, he has no training or skill with it at all. But after a few lessons, he's basically better than Braun, who's over 100 years old and very well skilled. And he's even comparable to an elf. So he's already a prodigy in that. He also learns to read in like a week, which is, suggests a high level of intelligence. And then not only does he learn to read like the common tongue, but he basically learns the ancient language in near, similar amount of time. He's not fluent, but he knows like a lot of it. So every little thing and just general use of magic, he picks up on it immediately and is good at it. So pretty much all those cliche fantasy protagonist things, he is just immediately good at. But the only thing that kind of saves him from being just boring, kind of Gary Stu, is the other parts of his personality that Christopher put in there. It definitely has to be a bit of a self insert because he was 15 at the time of writing it, and the character was 15 when the book starts and stuff. So it kind of feels like that. He's like very curious and he's like inquisitive and stuff, and that curiosity gets him in trouble. But he's also just whiny and petulant and just very, very stubborn in a way that's like, why? So it very much gives that teenager kind of feel. Every time someone says, like, I'm just going to tell you this and I'm not going to give you more information, you just got to kind of deal with it. He's, no! Like, he's, very classic little teenager stuff. And that stuff is kind of fun for me. It really kept me from, like, disliking the character because I like when characters are proficient, but I can't stand it when they're just so, like, unjustifiably perfect. So the fact that Eragon still does have a solid arc in this story, like, really is good, in my opinion. And it shows a lot of skill, inherent skill that Christopher had, even at the young age. Like, he clearly gives the character a full arc when in the hero's journey, it's almost common for the main protagonist not to even have much of an arc. Eragon goes from being like a kind of whiny, kind of depressed, because of the deaths that he experiences early on. He goes from being kind of whiny, a little petulant, and then like kind of depressed and stuff, to being very angry and revenge centered and stuff like that when he's going after the Razak. But then later he kind of takes on the mantle of being a rider and starts to learn what it means to be a dragon rider and starts to really appreciate that responsibility. And he starts to see things like slavery and stuff that he can't stand. It really irks him and everything. So he really does kind of mature over the course of this story, even though I know, having finished the series already, he continuously matures. But just in this first book alone, he takes a lot of leaps to become essentially who he needs to be like a great fantasy protagonist. And that's something that Christopher could have easily dropped the ball on, but I'm really happy he actually, stuck with it and it actually worked out really well. So apart from Eragon, the rest of our characters are also quite interesting. Bronn is obviously a great character. He's the cliche mentor type, so you can basically, as soon as you see him and realize he's going to be the mentor figure, you already know he's going to die. But his death kind of does impact the story in such a way that makes a lot of sense. So it's not just throwing these tropes and cliches in there just for the sake of it. He actually uses them and makes, good use of them. Even though this book is fairly thin on characters because there's only so many actual POV characters or truly like, important characters, the two main characters, of course, being Eragon and Saphira. Bronn has been a close third, but he leaves kind of 2/3 into the book. But then we also get Murtagh, who is, even though he shows up 2/3, probably, more into the book, he actually does a lot of work to become like a solid secondary protagonist, like sets up a great mystery and stuff. And he's a really interesting character, which, years and years later is why we're going to get a solo Murtagh book. So those are honestly the main characters. We don't really even get to meet Arya too much. Like the shade Durza has no real nuance to him. He's just evil for the sake of evil because he's essentially like a low tier first boss before we get to Galbatorix, the main boss who we don't even see in this one. So even just the structure of those kind of villain arcs from like almost a video game perspective, I think Christopher did a good job with. But the thing that I really like the most about the Eragon series, all the coming of age stuff, yes, all that stuff is fun. There's a reason why a lot of that stuff is, lived as long as it has and, is getting used over and over and over. It's because it works. But the thing I really, really like about the series is the thing that the adaptation basically took out of it. It's the world building. Of course, it's no big, big surprise. Cameron loves the world building. But, like, I really love the world building and the magic system. I think the world that he created is really, really interesting. While a lot of it can be kind of just filled in with generic stuff that, the ideas are kind of built from Tolkien and stuff like that, you can kind of fill in a lot of that stuff, at least as far as the dwarves, because the dwarves are probably, they get a lot of characterization, but they're not as deeply characterized as, say, the elves. But we're familiar with these types of races and stuff. And the orcs are essentially, the Urgals are essentially orcs, even to the point of mixing them up. Like, so there's a lot of that. But there's a lot of interesting, unique things in the world, like cats and things, and just the kind of the nature of the way dragons work on the world and affect the world is fairly unique in my opinion. I haven't seen anything about it. Like the concept of their Eldunari, which is a thing that comes later in later books, so I won't go into much detail about it. But just kind of the idea of it's really the magic system, because the world itself affects the magic system and the magic system affects the world. So I think it's really interesting that the magic system in Eragon is basically right in the middle. It's essentially a soft magic system in that you can cause all sorts of effects to happen, like a very, wow, ooh, ah kind of thing, but it has very clear rules, and those rules are essentially immutable. So it is very much right in the middle, because those rules create interesting limitations that our characters have to work their way around, which is another way we can tell Eragon is like, a prodigy, because using the ancient language to weave organic spells and things like this, it requires talent, and it requires like skill and knowledge and stuff. And this dude is doing it like year one. He's already crafting stuff and doing stuff that are basically on the level of a master magic user. So I thought that's kind of interesting. But the most interesting thing is the different sources of magic. So there are wizards, witches, sorcerers, shades, dragon riders, and just general magic practitioners. So regular ones will be like witches or something. They use spells and herbs and potions and like those kind of things where they get their powers. Then there's like sorcerers and stuff like shades, who are sorcerers that have basically been taken over. But the sorcerers basically use spirits. They can control spirits and stuff and get them to do their bidding and like make use of their power. But shades are people who have been completely possessed by those spirits and have essentially, become the spirits, that the dark spirits they were using to do their bidding and stuff. So that's a whole other thing. And then dragon riders' magic comes from dragons themselves, essentially, because they are themselves kind of a magical type creature, and they have effects that are even completely unknown to them, or how to control, how to control it. They can't even control some of their magical effects. So I think that's really unique, because it kind of gives a sense of multiple magic systems, even though it's all essentially magic. I mean, actually, it's all magic, but they are effectively different magic systems, because there's differences between using the ancient language of the elves to use magic, and then using spirits and stuff. So the process is different, even though a lot of it still uses the ancient language. But I think that's just unique, because there's, nuances, and there's like small little bits and bobs here, and there's crevices and stuff to look under, and just, interesting things. Like I said before, one of my favorite things about world building and magic systems is that it gives me interest in the story that goes beyond the plot. So just everything that happens in the Eragon series is fine and dandy and it's cool, but the world itself is interesting enough that I would really love stories that just take place in the world, kind of randomly. So that's just one of the markers of a good magic system, in my opinion. So even though Eragon is considered really generic and really bland and kind of cliche, I think it's anything but. I think all the unique additions and ideas that Christopher added into the series, that is mostly made up of the hero's journey and kind of a coming of age kind of cliche story. I don't even want to call it a cliche, but like using those sorts of tropes and kind of archetypes for this story, like, was a great kind of through line way for him to interject all these interesting, unique things that kind of makes it his own. So I'm really happy that we're getting more stuff that's going on in this world, because the Murtagh takes place like a year after the fourth book. So we're kind of almost picking up right where we left off. So I'm really happy that we're getting more in this world. We get to explore more about the world building and more about the world that he's created here. So I just really like it. So let me know in the comments down below. Were you one of those people who just felt like it's just generic, cliche, fanfare kind of thing? Like, are you familiar with the actually interesting, unique things that Paolini put in the book that the adaptation just completely stripped out? Let me know about that in the comments down below. And as always, if you're interested in supporting the channel, you can check out the Patreon. The link is down in the description. And as always, please make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And I will talk to you all next time. Peace.